Hi, I'm Juliet Richards, and today I'm going to be talking to you about environmental chemicals and how they may be impacting on your own health. So the chemicals that we are talking about specifically in this video are persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. So these organic pollutants, and please don't be misled by the word organic. So we're not talking about organic like organic food or organic farming. Organic just simply means like living organisms. So these are pollutants that persist in our environment and our ecosystems and the organisms that live in these ecosystems. So the World Health Organization released this statement a few years ago saying persistent organic pollutants are chemicals of global concern due to their potential for long-range transport, persistence in the environment, ability to biomagnify and bioaccumulate in ecosystems, as well as their significant negative effects on human health and the environment. So a pretty heavy statement coming from the World Health Organization. So these persistent organic pollutants are fat-loving. So they basically will persist in organisms because they hang out in fat. Whereas chemicals that are water-loving, so they're water-soluble, these chemicals tend to remain in our blood, so our kidneys have a chance to actually filter them out. So they tend not to persist as much. Whereas these fat-soluble chemicals, they really can persist for, I'm talking years and even decades, in either organisms in our environment or in our own bodies. So when we're talking about biomagnification, this is where you get organisms at the bottom of the food chain that may contain an amount of this contaminant or this pollutant. And then the organism above them in the food chain, when they when they eat that organism, they actually ingest the contaminant or the pollutant as well. So the higher you go up in the food chain, the more this contaminant is accumulated or magnified. So the organism at the top of the food chain is going to have the greatest amount of this pollutant. Then when we're talking about bioaccumulation, this is where the contaminant or the pollutant accumulates slowly over time. So as time goes on, you accumulate more and more of this pollutant in the fat of that organism. So there have been over 4,000 chemicals that have entered the food supply, either intentionally like preservatives or inadvertently like PBA, for example, which is what they use on the lining of tins or cans. And there's over 1,500 chemicals that enter the market every single year. The trouble is that these chemicals have not been thoroughly studied in humans, and only a handful of these thousands of chemicals have undergone rigorous testing. And we know of these thousands of chemicals that at least 175 of them are harmful to human health. The other trouble is when researchers do these tests or do blood level tests on these individual chemicals, the levels or the blood concentrations of the individual chemical might be low, but it's actually the total amount of all of these chemicals combined that can be of concern. Because remember, there's thousands of them. So if we're testing for one chemical, it may not look so bad, but it's the combination of all of these chemicals. And because they're fat-loving, they all hang out in fat together. And it's these mixtures that cause problems. The other problem is that these chemicals, really the research in this area is in its infancy. So we just don't know enough about what the long-term effects are. It's unethical to do a study where we expose humans to these chemicals to see if there are health consequences. And so we have to rely on animal studies. But then they're given much higher concentrations of these chemicals. And it's also the long-term consequences of and how they impact on our health. So really there's still so much we don't know, but we know that a lot of these chemicals in our environment are harmful to human health. So if you think about the amount of rubbish that you produce as one human in one day, that's a lot of rubbish just for one human in one day. Then think about how much rubbish or waste you produce as a household. Then what about your neighbourhood? And what about your state and your country? It is so much waste every single day. And that waste has to go somewhere. So it ends up in landfills or it gets burned off, but these chemicals don't just disappear. They have to go somewhere. So they end up in our environment, they end up in our soil, they end up in our water, and then they end up in our food. Roughly 2/3 of all plastic ever produced has been released into our environment and remains there in some form. So whether it is in our soil, whether it is in our ocean or our drinking water or our bodies, it remains there in some form. Because these persistent organic pollutants are fat-loving, they accumulate together. So when they're in the ocean, for example, these pollutants will all stick together, and they can concentrate up to 100 times that of the background seawater. So the greatest source of these persistent organic pollutants in terms of how we are exposed to them is through dietary intake of animal foods or animal products. So whether it's meat, dairy, eggs and fish. Because it hangs out in the fat of these animals or these products, then when we ingest them, we accumulate it. So it's a combination of this bioaccumulation and biomagnification in our environment. And it's actually fish that have the highest levels of all these different animal products, in particular farmed fish. So these persistent organic pollutants can have a whole range of different effects, but in particular, they can disrupt our endocrine system. So when we're talking about diabetes, the endocrine system is the system of hormones in our body, and hormones are chemical messages that send messages throughout our body to do different things. And we remember that insulin is a hormone. So these chemicals will persist in our body, and some of them have also been referred to as obesogens because they can also contribute to obesity and weight gain. So these chemicals can cause weight gain, they can cause other issues like infertility, but they can also lead to insulin resistance by having direct effects on the beta cells in the pancreas which produce insulin, but they can also contribute to inflammation and insulin resistance that way. So how can you then reduce your exposure to these POPs or persistent organic pollutants? So the first thing you could do, and what I really encourage everyone to do, is to try and reduce your waste. So there's no point sticking your head in the sand and, handing out that rubbish to the rubbish man and not thinking about it ever again. It's really about being mindful of how much waste you're producing, because at the end of the day, that is going to end up in your environment and it can come back and bite you on the bum because it will end up coming back in your food. So trying to minimise your waste, so many different ways you can do that. Just reusing your shopping bags, getting a reusable coffee cup so you're not using disposable ones every time, buying things in bulk instead of buying things in lots of individual packages. So lots of different things you can do, but just being more mindful. So next time you throw the rubbish out, think about how you can reduce the amount of waste you're producing. And the other thing you can do is to minimise your use of pre-packaged foods. So when you're eating, or when there's food stored in plastic or even in cans, I suppose, with the BPA being an issue, but when you're eating foods out of pre-packaged plastic, for example, there's the chance that these chemicals can get into your food, so they can leach into your food. If the food is kept in a cool place, like in the fridge, out of light, then there's less chance of these chemicals leaching into your food. And if you're removing the plastic before you heat it up or eat it, then that's also going to help. So the worst offenders really are when you are buying food in a plastic container and you put that in the microwave and heat it up. You're going to get a lot more of those chemicals leaching out. Another thing you could do is to reduce your intake of animal food or animal products so that you're minimising your exposure to these potentially accumulated chemicals in the fat. And it's not as good as just cutting the fat around the edges because there's still going to be fat in the actual meat. So reducing your intake of these animal products, particularly farmed fish, because we know they contain the highest levels of these POPs. And another thing you could do is to lose weight, which I know we're probably all trying to do most of the time anyway. But losing some of the fat on your body, you potentially are also losing or getting rid of some of those pollutants. Now, at the end of the day, we have to remember that human health is largely dependent on planetary health. So we can't stick our head in the sand any longer. It's about being more mindful about what we're putting in our own bodies, but also what we're putting back into the environment. It's understanding that it doesn't just disappear and it can come back around and bite us in the bum. I know when I learned about all of this, it definitely changed my behaviour, and I was definitely more mindful about the waste that I'm producing and about what I put in my body and what things that I eat and how that may, what sort of implications that might have. So I hope this has been insightful, and I hope that you've found it helpful. If so, make sure you like it, send it out to or share it with your friends and family, and make sure you sign up to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on upcoming videos.